It's disabled it. Maar hier staat dat de host.
Are we still waiting for folks, Alice?
I think we're still missing some people, but I guess they can just trickle in.
Just set up
yeah, because there's a good number of people here, so I think we can start. Yeah, are we ready?
You see us set up a second camera? So if you want, you can use that when you want. If you want, you can manually edit that into a shot if you want.
Okay. Cool. All right, let's start. Okay, well, hello everyone. Welcome to our virtual environmental art tour. My name is Alice. I am the communications coordinator here at Wild Bird Trust, and yeah, I'm really excited for our event today. But before we start, I do want to let you guys know that we do have some more online events coming up. So we have a Dawn Chorus listening party tomorrow at 1 p.m. with Donna Clark, where basically you just sit back and relax and listen to some bird songs that we recorded from Maplewood Flats. And on June 20th, we have a special presentation on conservation, restoration, and cultural reclamation by Tsleil-Waututh members Hilary Highland and Iggy George. And that will also include a screening to a short film. So those are some really exciting events that are coming up for us. And if you want to join them, I will be putting a link to the sign up in the chat. Yeah, so if you want to check those out, that'd be great. And finally, for this event, we do want this to be a really interactive session. So, you know, if you're comfortable unmuting yourself and showing your video, that would be great. We want you to interact and ask questions and make this feel like a in-person event as much as possible. So if you're comfortable doing that, that's great. And we also will be simulcasting this event and recording this event so that more people can learn about art and culture and how that connects to conservation. And with that, I'll pass it over to Irwin, who is giving our tour today.
Thanks very much, Alice. Nice to see you folks. We'll be allowing some people to enter the Zoom late, so there'll be some people added as we start. It's been spotty rain for the last half an hour, so I will probably be staying indoors, but we have the mobile camera as well, so we could pop outside if the weather's good. I prepared a PowerPoint, so we'll mostly be working through that. And why don't we, what I'll do is I'll do the PowerPoint, the presentation, and then we will perhaps do a quick introduction of each other or have a bit more involved discussion. So the first half will be perhaps a presentation, we can call it that, and then the second half will be discussion. There's lots of expertise in the room, and I want to welcome those conversations and those inputs. I see Donna Clark is here. She's the chair of our programs committee, which is the committee responsible for public art here at the Flats. I see the North Vancouver Arts Council is here, and so lots of capacity. I see Katrin and Hank from the Dutch consulate in Vancouver here, so greetings to the Netherlands from the unceded lands of the Slough here in North Vancouver. So this is, in terms of territorial acknowledgements, it's something that we commonly do in settler culture. It's something that's become kind of a norm in Vancouver. And people would typically say, well, we're on the unceded lands, or we want to acknowledge the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish. But we do it a little bit differently here because we want to address the fact that there's different legal interpretations of this notion of land acknowledgement. One can say, like the city of Vancouver in 2014 acknowledged that the city of Vancouver occupies unceded lands. What that means is essentially that the lands were never legally treated, were never won by war. And in British Columbia, most of British Columbia is this historical anomaly in North America where the lands were never ceded. So technically, legally, the municipalities and the provincial government occupies unceded lands, which is essentially, one can consider that an illegal action, or it could be something to be discussed and negotiated. We saw just recently the Untitled and the Wet'suwet'en move forward on their rights and title by the Crown acknowledging that, in fact, as the Supreme Court did with the Delgamuthun decision years ago, that in fact that it's up to the Wet'suwet'en people to actually negotiate what that means between the band councils and the sovereign government systems, the houses, the clan systems, the family democratic systems. And so we're in this weird moment in history where we as settlers and migrants, speaking for myself, we have this work to do. And so territorial acknowledgements is a part of that work, but it really is just the stepping stone. It's kind of the welcome mat at the front of the house. And so often by simply doing a quick token, we're on the unceded lands, it actually doesn't get into the substance of those complexities. And especially when you're in a union or a church or a community organization or a government, you may not have actually done that work of figuring out what is the relationship between your organization and the local First Nations. So acknowledgements sort of bypass a lot of good work that could happen. And so we really encourage folks to do more substantive work around that. So that'll be my form of territorial acknowledgements. We are here in North Vancouver. We're just 200 meters away from the Tsleil-Waututh's Burrard Indian Reserve. So we have a particular important relationship to that community, to that First Nation. And it's through this talk today, we'll talk about public art, we'll talk about environmental art, we'll talk about conservation, but it's really framed in this context of decolonization. So terminology is important, and I'm happy to answer questions around terminology. What I'll start now, though, is I'll share my screen, and we'll jump in. All right. Can everyone see that okay? Yeah. So, you know, many people, we think about this site, Maplewood Flats, in a brief moment in time. We think about it often in the context of the 1970s. And that's because there was a very significant squatter history on the waterfront here. As many as 3,000 squatter shacks lying the waterfront of Vancouver, Burnaby, Richmond. And those would have been working class fisher folk. There would have been workers who maybe worked in the mills or were loggers up in northern British Columbia, and they would come back to Vancouver and they wouldn't afford a house, and they could live for free on the intertidal zones. That was the law back then. The intertidal zone was below the high tide and above the low tide. So 3,000 working class shacks dotted the waterfront all across Metro Vancouver. Finn Slough in Richmond is really the only remaining community. But Maplewood Flats was renowned for that community. And I mention that because often we think about public art in the context of these replicas by Ken Lum. And I'll talk about that in a few more minutes. But I want to situate myself in this talk as much as possible. So some of you know me as the president of the Wild Bird Trust of British Columbia, and that's the organization that caretakes this site, Maplewood Flats. We have a lease on the site until 2041. But on a personal level, why I'm giving this talk is this is a particular area of research that I've been involved in for a few decades. In 2005, I did a postgraduate certificate at Capilano University, and one of my graduation projects was a project called Whey-ah-Wichen, Facing the Wind. Does anyone know why we refer to, what Whey-ah-Wichen refers to? Anyone want to jump in?
Kate's Park, it's when they name it.
Yeah, so Kate's Park is interesting because it's the first municipal park in British Columbia that's co-managed by First Nation. That started in 1995. And in that co-management, there became a renaming of the park. So the park became Kate's, which is the Kate's family, the tugboat family. That was an industrious family in the north of Vancouver's history. So Kate's Park, which part of the land was donated to the district for a park, became Kate's Park / Whey-ah-Wichen. And Whey-ah-Wichen literally means facing the wind, because at Roche Point there, where Malcolm Lowry, the famous author, squatted from the 40s to the 50s, it's a very windy corner there, which is just across from Westridge Terminal, the Kinder Morgan output, where the oil currently and the bitumen in the future would go on to ships. It's right across from there in Burrard Inlet. And I did a piece on this because I had started a festival in 1990, which became the largest social justice festival in Canada every year. That ran for 20 years, 1990 to 2010. That was called Under the Volcano. And,
you did that, Irwin?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Amazing.
So I had a particular interest in that site. In that site, we would welcome 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8,000 people sometimes to that beautiful site. And it was always interesting to me that particular site was under the purview of my father. My father, from 1959 to 1993, was the parks manager for North Vancouver. So I grew up learning about these local parks and my dad's philosophy around balancing. For the Dutch in the room, they would know Keukenhof, this balance between nature and gardens. And his philosophy was very much what we see now in North Vancouver, which was this focus on protecting wilderness, protecting and promoting trail systems, not Victorian gardens. So you don't actually see any rose gardens in North Vancouver parks. You tend to see more green spaces. And so, so Kate's Park, I think, one of the stories my father told me when his first day on the job in 1959, one of the first things he did was he covered up the middens. The Tsleil-Waututh had these middens at Kate's Park that tourists and locals would come to on the weekends and scavenge and steal things.
Oh no!
Would remove objects, because these middens of thousands of years of accumulation from cooking implements and shells would have trinkets and objects, cultural objects, and so people would be stealing them. So one of the first things he remembers doing was covering it with soil and grass seed, and essentially just protecting them and burying them, and essentially so that the Tsleil-Waututh could in the future could access them on their own terms rather than the settlers going in and pillaging.
I'd like to bring up that I found a shell midden in an unknown area that had never been discovered before. It's over by McKay Creek near the mouth, near before it gets to the mouth. But just on the bank with heavy rain, suddenly the bank went away and there was a shell midden.
Yeah.
So we did contact the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh.
Yeah. So the Squamish and the Tsleil-Waututh have been here since time immemorial, and that's a lot of this talk is really about figuring out what our relationship is to it. So I was born here in 1966 by Lynn Creek, so I have 53 years experience being here on the land. A lot of my cultural practice and curating practice is land-based, and that's sort of where I want to focus this conversation. So this exhibition that I organized I included a Tsleil-Waututh artist and a Squamish artist. So we had three perspectives. We're all sort of the same age. We'd all grown up in North Vancouver, and so the exhibition that I produced was a mix of, I had images, for example, where Michelle at a particular age in her backyard, or Damien swinging on the swings with his brothers, Reuben, George, and others, and then myself. And so we sort of blurred these photographs together of kids growing up in North Vancouver. But in fact, we had very, very distinct realities, right? So my Tsleil-Waututh friends were growing up in pretty significant poverty. Genocidal programs of the Canadian government were still very much in play there, the residential school systems, things like that. So when I grew up in North Vancouver, it was these wondrous forests, and there's forests behind my elementary school and down from where I lived. And so for me, growing up in North Vancouver was this beautiful experience of living in nature. Little did I know that my family's house had only been built 5 years before I grew up, right? So those subdivisions were in fact pulled out of the forest, and what I experienced as the forest was really the remaining forest from what had not been built into subdivisions. Then as I went through elementary school, in turn, those forests became new subdivisions. So we're really only just talking about decades of colonialism here in North Vancouver. And I have to point out the fact that in 1949, just over next to Kate's Park, Whey-ah-Wichen, there would have been a real estate sign saying, no Asians, and you had to have $2,000 to and a certain amount of square footage of your house plan to be able to purchase those subdivision lots, right? So no Asians, and you had to be middle class. So essentially that's 1949. So that's not a long time ago. So I've just, some of you know, I just graduated from Simon Fraser University in communications, and my research work is on what this is that I'm telling you. It's place-based redress. It's locating my own self and doing autoethnographic research about what it is, how I see the world as a settler here in unceded lands. So a lot of my research is about the subject that we're talking about today. And I just want to frame it just to start the conversation so that you know the lens that I use. And this is the lens that I promote other settlers and migrants using, which is really about honoring history and not becoming too responsive or distracted by the way Canada has been playing out its reconciliation program. And what I argue is, essentially, is that reconciliation is spectacle. I borrow Guy Debord's theories from 1967 in France, where he talks about how spectacle, and we only have to look south of the border now with Donald Trump to see how effective hyperreality and spectacle can be used to distract the public. But I also argue that spectacle is used in a Canadian context, much like Justin Trudeau used multiculturalism in the 70s, that Justin Trudeau now uses reconciliation. And so reconciliation really, to borrow Pam Palmater's words or Russ Diablo's words, reconciliation has to include land. It has to include redress. Just talking about reconciliation as if it's something that happened and we just have to apologize for and just have to have a bit of education about actually doesn't do reconciliation any justice. Reconciliation needs justice, and justice might include reparations, might include land return, but it has to involve something substantive because of the harm done to First Nations. So that's my own personal research work that I do as a graduate research at Simon Fraser, and this is a website that I use where I put some of that research, and that's called Redress Vancouver, and I'm working on a book right now on this subject of Redress Vancouver. So in that practice, and here we're going to start talking about culture and arts, I organize a lot of these sessions where I train the arts community in Vancouver. This is the fifth symposium that I've organized in the last few years. This was in November, just before COVID, and this was at 312 Main Street in Vancouver. So there we bring arts and culture professionals, programmers, executive directors, board members from different arts and culture organizations, predominantly from Vancouver. And I organize essentially peer training or train the trainers methods. It's sort of a professional development day where people can learn about culture. This is the schedule from the last one. So if you look at the agenda, you can see that we're really talking about I don't know if you can see my little arrow here, but personal change. So what is our own relationship? And I think there's been a huge amount of learning, collective learning from Minneapolis and what we're learning about Black Lives Matter. You know, if one watches CBC or CNN, we're inundated with media images and stories about what does white supremacy mean. Well, if you had said white supremacy on CBC 5 years ago, you know, you would have been identified as some kind of a fringe theorist or left-wing radical. Now the language of white supremacy is actually becoming normalized because the inability for media or for the dominant discourse to kind of push it aside as some radical idea, that's becoming more mainstream. It's becoming more accepted that, in fact, yes, there is structural racism. And we only had, this week, we had the RCMP step back. Earlier in the week, on Monday, you had the head of the RCMP saying she doesn't know what structural racism is, which is astounding, given that the Supreme Court of Canada has already identified structural racism in Canadian institutions. And then you had yesterday the head of the RCMP walking back and saying, yes, she does agree that there is structural racism in the RCMP, and we've had cases after cases of examples of that. So personal change is really an opportunity for us to think about what is our relationship. So I talk about being a Dutch settler, talk about my role as a white male, and I frame that so that the listener can understand this is my world experience. It might not be yours, but if you share my experience, then you may be able to can relate to my experience and learn from that. So then we also have to look at the organizations that we work with. So what I'll talk about a little bit today is the Wild Bird Trust, and I invite Donna and others in the Zoom to add their comments. So if you're in a church, or if you're in a municipal government, or you're in a corporation, we've seen a lot of that this week where heads of corporations are stepping in and saying, you know, we are going to do better for Black folks, or with the reconciliation, you had everything from commitments around reconciliation. Now you even see reconciliation pipelines, or you see basically reconciliation. The term has become so bastardized that anything can mean reconciliation. So it's sort of lost its meaning. But it's important for organizations to think, okay, what does reconciliation mean to us? What are our systems? How do we relate to First Nations in our neighborhoods, in our local areas? And so we no longer get the pass of saying, well, we don't really know that, or that's work for First Nations to do. People are starting to realize that colonialism in Canada is a white person's problem. Colonialism in Canada is not an Indigenous problem, right? So it's about owning that. Just like we're learning about Black Lives Matter on the media this week, people are realizing, oh, that's not a problem for Black people to solve. It's actually a problem for whites to solve. And then the community change. What can be done when organizations and arts organizations in particular in this event, what can be done when the arts organizations work together on policy changes, on funding systems? So that's a little bit about the work that I do. This is a talk that I organized. It's on YouTube. I encourage you to check that out. There's already 5,000 views on it, so it's very popular. It means it strikes a chord for folks. And I encourage you to check that out. It's called Making Coast Salish Territorial Acknowledgements Matter, the emphasis on the word matter. All right, so here we are, and I think it's important to locate ourselves. We're here at Maplewood Flats, and here's a photo of where I am. I'm right over here in the woods here, which would be right about here. And so this map from 150 years ago really shows something quite striking. And I show it for two reasons. One, because I'm a scholar at Simon Fraser University, which is this site on Burnaby Mountain. And it strikes me that this is the first image where you start to see enclosures, this notion of terra nullius, this idea that this land was never used, it was unproductive. There's all types of belief systems that are required to believe this notion that this land was not used, that this land was not productive, right? Because we've experienced 2 cycles of genocidal smallpox. So the Indigenous population here was in the tens of thousands. Smallpox wiped out 90% of that population. And so the white settlers who came on the train and decided that they were going to land grab, and you see here the very first enclosures. And enclosures is an important concept. I think it comes out of the parishes of England. This notion that there was land that was controlled by the parish, and that the peasants served the village, but it was really always owned by the parish, the head of the religious parish. And so that notion of enclosure versus the commons is a historical relic that comes out of the UK in previous centuries. But here you see a perfect example of 150 years ago where there is settler enclosures bestowed by, this is pre-Canada. Canada doesn't even exist yet. And so this is pre-Confederation. And it's important that we remember that that is our history. That is where we are today. And we're only repairing what was done at this phase 150 years ago. So in 2016 or 2017, I became president here in the Wild Bird Trust, and with Chloe Hartley and Donna Clark and a whole number of people, Pundal, we embarked on a habitat restoration and cultural use plan for Maplewood Flats. And the important emphasis for today is this cultural use. Right, so habitat and conservation is fairly easy to understand. It's the restoration, it's bringing back the biodiversity here. You know, we have a mandate to run this site as a bird sanctuary, but in fact, one can't have a bird sanctuary without flowers and fruit and roots, insects, salamanders. You know, the whole biodiversity that exists here, even the predators, the predator birds, as well as the bears and the deer, bobcat. We had a bobcat here last year. So all that biodiversity exists. We're not just a place where one looks at birds in a museum. So that's an important thing to consider, is biodiversity and restoration. But then it's a very colonial notion that we think of biodiversity and we think of ecology as something that white folks do studying a petri dish or doing data, analyzing data sets. When we think about ecology and we include the human beings in a decolonization context, we're quickly saying, well, what's the human use? What is the human use of the site? You know, this site that we're on here is fill, right? So I don't know if you can see outside the windows here, but maybe I'll put this the site here is former mud flat, and you can see here in the image just a piece of that. This is 1949, I believe, in the top of this slide here. Well, that mud flat went all the way to the Lionsgate Bridge. You know, the whole North Shore was contiguous mud flats. And so what Maplewood mud flats represents is the last remaining piece of that. There's a couple of other tiny spots, but really this is the only piece of mud flats left. And it was destroyed as recently as 1950s, 1960s, when thousands of truckloads of fill were removed from the west end of Vancouver and dumped right here on this pristine mud flat. And then it was industrialized. And so we saved an industrialized area that was actually not a natural habitat for wildlife. We rescued, and now we recognize, one could argue, we stole or restole for the second time land that was adjacent to the reserve lands from the Tsleil-Waututh Nation and said, oh, this is a wild bird area. When in fact, if you were a Tsleil-Waututh member, you know, you'd already had most of your land area removed by the occupying state. You had it industrialized with Chevron, with Suncor, with oil and gas infrastructure, rail lines, all that environmental racism that surrounds the Tsleil-Waututh. You know, when you live in Burnaby, you're buffered geographically with Barnett Highway and forest between the Barnett Highway and the waterfront. But if you're actually on the waterfront, it's heavily industrialized. So if you're in the Tsleil-Waututh reserve lands, you actually look out at heavily industrialized land areas that the middle-class suburb of Burnaby actually doesn't necessarily witness out of their windows. So it's something to consider. And so this area is it is immoral for us to consider doing restoration work and wildlife conservation, maintaining this notion that the Tsleil-Waututh have no historical role here. I would argue, in fact, that the Tsleil-Waututh have been doing far more habitat restoration, far more advancement of the Wild Bird Trust's agenda and our mandate than we have. You know, they've been spending millions of dollars on restoring Burrard Inlet's quality of life for wildlife and for biodiversity. They've been championing, not just with the issue of the Kinder Morgan pipeline, but they've been doing lots of restoration work in Burrard Inlet and up Indian Arm. And so that directly benefits the birds at Maplewood Flats. We don't have a glass wall around Maplewood Flats, right? So the birds, these aren't our jurisdiction birds and those jurisdiction birds. No, actually it's contiguous. So, and then we think about the stewardship, the thousands of years of stewardship that the Slough members have performed. So that stewardship is consistent with our work. And so considering our work as not a Western scientific restorative work, but in fact a work that involves culture, it involves habitat stewardship, and human use. And so historically, if more than 90% of the Slough diet was shellfish and fish and seafood, it would be impossible to separate the Slough from the landscape. You know, and as Carlene Thomas, many of you have heard her say when she talks about when the tide goes out, the table is set, right? So that means that the food sources were, in fact, when the tide goes out, that's where the food sources exist, the shellfish. But the flats here where we are now, the pH is not even sufficient, the right pH, because of the pollution and the industrialization. pH actually can't support the hardening of the shellfish. So that's one of the reasons why the Slough are so committed to doing restoration work. So this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the traditional ecological knowledge. So our organization has embraced this. And this was at our last annual general meeting just in November. And something we're very committed to doing is decolonizing our own systems. So this is very much about the conservation. Yes, there's human involvement, but we're really looking at our restoration programs, our scientific work. But today I really want to focus more on the cultural stuff. One way we communicate our work is through our magazine called Wingspan, which I assume many of you are subscribers to. And if you're not, please join the Wild Bird Trust of British Columbia and you'll receive the magazine in the mail, or I'll personally hand deliver it to your house. And we're really proud of this magazine because it's a vehicle for us to reach about 7,000 or 8,000 readers to talk about these ideas, to break down the siloing of nature and culture, that somehow these are separated. We are really arguing that they're actually together. Some of the work we do here, right now there's a John Lohman exhibition that you can see behind me of extraordinary photos of birds and wildlife here. But depending on COVID, our next planned exhibition is Homecoming, featuring the life and contributions of Chief Dan George. And we've chosen that very specifically. It's a touring exhibition from the North Vancouver Museum that was developed in partnership with the family, with the George family. And, there you have, arguably the most important Indigenous and well-known Indigenous man in North America. For those who don't know that history, made famous in particular from his 1967 centennial commemoration speech that he gave in front of 30,000 people at Empire Stadium, where he called out Canada in 1967, July the 1st, but also from his Clint Eastwood films, Oscar-winning Clint Eastwood films. The Osprey Festival is a project that we do. It's now in its 14th year, I believe, and there's a program where, again, we make a real strong emphasis on highlighting Coast Salish artists amongst the non-Coast Salish presenters. So really a hybrid festival that connects and gives an opportunity for people to learn about local Indigenous history as well as settler history. This is a day we do in February. Again, it's in time with the BC Family Day, but again, we're focusing on how can we use all these platforms as opportunities to kind of walk the talk and give our members and the public an opportunity to learn about Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish history, while they're also celebrating nature here at Maplewood Flats. And it's critical to recognize that the knowledge holders are the elders. The knowledge holders the knowledge manifests through cultural sharing. We can see there the children of Takaya performing here, actually right where I'm sitting. And we see Elder Iggy and Dee from the Tsleil-Waututh. I've heard Iggy talk about the oil spill of 2007, when there was an oil spill in Burnaby. I believe it was 2007. And a pipeline, an excavator broke into the pipeline, and the oil spilled across a neighborhood of Burnaby and flowed into Burrard Inlet. Iggy has been paddling in a canoe in Burrard Inlet for decades, probably as many as 7 decades. And Iggy knows more about where that oil would flow because he knows exactly where the currents are. And so he knew where the oil would flow, and he, ahead of anybody else, he predicted exactly where the oil would flow, and that's where they found it. And so that kind of oral storytelling and oral history from the knowledge keepers is critical for us as an organization, because this is the knowledge. As much as I've learned in my 30 years of researching these issues, I'm only beginning to learn. Frankly, when you think about the knowledge that folk like Iggy has. This is an exhibition we did here last year, Words Rising, Birds Rising, and that was an exhibition that Kamala Todd curated at the Roundhouse, and that our programs committee delivered. And it was a beautiful example of the intersection between wildlife and bird knowledge, language, oral history, written history, and important for us because it's about us activating this space. In 2015, we opened this building. We had many donors bring this building to life that I'm sitting in right now, and but we didn't have resources to program the building. So this exhibition was one of the first ones, and here we're witnessing another one from John Lohman. We're really in a period now, and I invite you, and to be frank, it's one of the reasons why I'm hosting this talk today, is I really want to invite our members to think about how we can activate this building along these themes of welcoming First Nations, breaking the silos between culture and ecology. So we've started an artist in residence program. We had, now I think next year will be our third year. And again, using the different platforms here. So Bree McDaniel is a musician, a visual artist, and by giving her space and time, it helps her career, but also she gives back, and she helps us understand those intersections between culture and in this case, her love for birding. So we would welcome. I know Donna is
nice
writing.
Recorder.
Yeah, it's a nice one. That's actually a Zoom. It's funny, I was going to call it a Zoom, but now we think about Zooms as a video conferencing tool, but Zoom recorders are great. So we welcome ideas around artist in residence as well. There's a distinct fetishization around this period I mentioned at the outset, around how, in particular, the senior artists in Vancouver that you might be familiar with from the Vancouver Art Gallery. You know, there's a certain fetishization of their maturation as visual artists on the West Coast, and some of them have roots and ties to this site through the squatter shacks of the late 60s, early 70s. The District of North Vancouver burned them out in 1971, and you can check out Mud Flats Living. It's a lovely film, Mud Flats Living, on nfb.ca. So the National Film Board has a free video version of Mud Flats Living from 1971. I encourage you to check that out. So we don't want to erase that settler history, but nor do we want to put it on a pedestal and say, oh, this is the only important public art that's here. We want to really kind of put it into context, and this is what I'm partly doing today with this talk. We also want to use the space as a space for coffee houses. So that's a poster that we did 2 years ago, where we had Rob, who's on the call here today, Sonaquila. We had show her photography mixed with live music. So it was a slideshow of these beautiful bird images with beautiful classical guitar playing. It was a really beautiful opportunity to kind of hear and think about birds and music in a different way. This is the Capilano sculptures that were at the Vancouver Art Gallery, commissioned by the Vancouver Art Gallery. It's called Shangri-La, and it was it was installed next to the Shangri-La Hotel on Georgia Street, which is the Vancouver Art Gallery's outdoor exhibition area. And there, the District of North Vancouver moved it on, sponsored the moving and the location. We have two landlords here, the Port of Vancouver and the District of North Vancouver, and so Richard Walton, the mayor at the time, used to hang out here at the squatter shacks, which probably means he was doing a lot of illicit drugs along with those squatters and the hippie squatters. So that was Richard Walton, and he had fond memories of his youth and also hanging out with Leonard George, the late Leonard George, former Chief Leonard George. He was 19 at the time, and you have a little nice cameo of Leonard George in that film, Mud Flats Living, that you can see at nfb.ca. So here's the Canlum pieces. One of these is the Malcolm Lowry cabin, so it's actually not from Maplewood. It's he's taken liberties, and it's a replica. These are about 1/3 of the size of the real thing, and that was from Roche Point. So that was a Malcolm Lowry, debatable, but one of the greatest authors of the 20th century, certainly in terms of autobiographies as a genre. Under the Volcano, Last Ferry Boat to Gabriola, many different books that he wrote while he squatted there. So we recognize this challenge of the fact that so many folks romanticize this history of the 1970s, but we really wanted to recognize the fact that the cultural history of the site does not start in the 1970s, right? It starts millennia ago. One could say the Ice Age, 13,000 years ago or longer. And so we commissioned these 4 artists' work that exists here in the landscape that I encourage you to check out. These are Squamish and Slough artists, and this is certainly the trajectory for our organization to say, how can art and culture be brought back here so that not just for our own settler consumption of art, as if we're going to a museum, but how can we actually consider that art has a different meaning and different context and a different use by Coast Salish folk, right? So if Slough children are coming down, walking down from the reserve lands, the village just 200, 300 meters away, what do they see here, right? Do they see their culture reflected back, or do they see settler culture? And one can argue that every time we see settler culture in their traditional lands, we're erasing their own cultural experience. And so it's very important for us to bring some face back to Slough's continued use of the site here for thousands of years. And this is not a finished thing. This is just an entry point. This is just the beginning of a conversation. This is just a tiny little step for our organization to practice redress. And again, this is why it shows that reconciliation and redress are two different things. Reconciliation, we can talk all we like about, we acknowledge this, we acknowledge that. Redress is actually something that when the kids grow up, Slough children grow up, that they come to the Maplewood Flats area and that they feel at home, that they feel that this is part of their traditional lands, that they see their culture reflected in their own day-to-day lives. And this is an important piece by Ocean Highland, and this was one of the first commissions. And again, it's actually her ancestors there, and you actually, where she's looking, her eyes can actually see her village, right? She can see the reserve lands right across the flats there. So it's important, again, in that context, that you're actually witnessing this public art in the landscape, but you actually can see right past the work, you can see the village site. And that is of very significant importance to connect the visitors, again, to the location. Again, this fantasy narrative that this is a wild bird sanctuary that has been wilderness and that it's reserved for wildlife viewing is a mistake. It's a mistake. You know, in fact, this was an industrialized area that was destroyed, was removed from the First Nations, and we're repairing that industrialized area. And a part of the repair work is recognizing one of my first slides, if you remember it, our habitat and cultural use planning, right? So we're not divorcing our understanding of restoration and habitat and biodiversity and birds, and we're including culture. So examples of environmental art, we talk about public art. There's public art in the landscape, and I'll show you examples of that in a minute. But there's also environmental art as a genre. And I think a lovely example of that the Vancouver Parks Board did a really good job of was the from the windfall. If you remember, a few years ago when there was a windstorm, a brutal windstorm, and many hundreds of trees fell in Stanley Park. And the Parks Board wisely involved Indigenous artists, including Coast Salish artists, to consider how those fallen trees could actually become works of art. And I want to emphasize these two types of art, right? There's ephemeral, it's temporal. So there's art that exists until it's taken back by the land. It becomes, or it's, you know, a tree, a wooden sculpture is in fact organic material. But instead of putting it into a gallery and saying, oh, this is high art, right? This is a cultural product to be consumed in formal contexts, i.e., you enter a museum space or a gallery space, and you consume this. You witness it, you enjoy it, you love it, you learn about it. Temporal and ephemeral arts are an opportunity to hear sound in the landscape. It's to see poetry in the landscape. It's to hear poetry read out loud in the landscape. It's to see, like the gleaners, am I using the right word? That use willow and create fence material that then in 10 years become overgrown and just form barriers, natural barriers. So there's ways to use cultural forms as tools. In some ways, perhaps one could argue that the Slough clam beds that they built over the thousands of years, and you see them up and down the coast here in British Columbia. In small inlets, you'll see a local First Nation has over thousands of years built clam beds, and they're manufactured, industrialized areas through rock formations that enable the local community to be harvesting clams. And so those types of manipulation of the landscape exist and have existed here for thousands of years. So in many ways, we're blurring the boundary between food production, agriculture, temporal artworks, cultural form in the landscape. And so this, I appreciate this commissioning process from the Stanley Park. And there's a little section on bird use. If we want, I have more information on this, so we can go back to this if we like. There's my friends Henk and Katrin from the Dutch consulate are here on the Zoom, and they've probably been to the Hoge Veluwe. It's a national park in the Netherlands, and the Kroller-Müller Museum. This is a great example, a world-renowned example of sculpture in landscape. And I think it's an important one for us to consider. You know, we've seen an example where we're bringing in commissioned works into the landscape in the form of Coast Salish images and designs, which is very similar to contemporary sculpture, right? So I think it's important for us to consider, as we receive about 80,000 visitors here to Maplewood Flats each year, do we want, and how much of that experience is observing birds in the landscape, and how much of it is pedagogical interaction? How much of it is, for example, children in the Cub Scouts coming with their school groups and seeing interpretive panels and displays, or artworks about birds, or artworks that are an entry point for the children to learn about those species and the landscape. So for us, we don't want to just think about interpretive displays as being static images with text, but can sculpture, can replicas of wildlife, can human beings interacting with wildlife be a part of that educational experience here at Maplewood Flats? And here's an example with Takaya Tours, which is a cultural practice, a transportation system, and it's a great way that we can all experience ocean-going canoes. This was the first time in living memory that we brought a ocean-going canoe here at Maplewood Flats.
What a fun ride that was, the Chief Dan George canoe.
Yeah.
Right in front of a big oil tanker.
Yeah, we went out, there was a tanker just going by. So, you know, so this is something we want to consider in the future. Is cultural experiences here a part of what people will experience? You know, once or twice or three times a week, would we be embarking in a canoe here with our friends at Takaya Tours? So that's something we're in discussion with the Slough Nation. And if you see here, if you can see my arrow, you know, here you see tens of thousands of tons of asphalt, just dumped on the shoreline, right? So we have a lot of restoration work we still have to do. You know, we shouldn't pretend that this is like a pristine natural environment. So there's lots of work we have to do. This is happening next week. Sorry, this is happening tomorrow.
River otters are using that riprap as a home and nesting area.
Yeah, thank you for that. So this is a talk, an event that's happening tomorrow, and we can talk about this just in a minute. That is the end of the slideshow. So I want to just show an example of this. Can you see the Stanley Park? Can you see the Stanley Park image or no? Let me try that again.
It was tiny, but we could see it.
Okay. So this is the other examples of the artworks from the Stanley Park project. Just want to quickly go over them. So some of these are actually designed to literally go back into the landscape. So this was the study a year and 2 years later saying, are creatures like spider mites, sow bugs, flies are starting to kind of decompose and help decompose these works. Plants are starting to surround them.
And termites.
Yeah. So this is a very deliberate approach approach to ephemeral art in the landscape, but still within the genre of environmental art. So I just want to end my presentation there and open up the discussion. Donna, perhaps, do you want to share some reflections on what you've just heard me share and what you're excited about, Donna? Just to unmute yourself.
Oh, okay. Just winging it here. No pun intended on the bird metaphor there. Hi, everybody. Good to see you.
Hi, Donna.
Hi. And the programs committee chair. And I'm a high school visual art teacher. So I'm very fond of art. Well, you asked me specifically to comment on ephemeral and or semi-permanent art, and you did so. You're putting me on the spot here, and I do have something to say. I think that, of course, I do think that ephemeral art, there's a number of really sweet things about ephemeral art, and one, I think it's a really accessible art form. I think that I'm hoping we can do more ephemeral art at Maplewood because it's accessible to children. Children can be making ephemeral art and leaving it for other children and people to see. It's an art form that the average person can participate in, and it hasn't got the preciousness or the exaltedness that permanent art forms have, and so we're a little more relaxed. We tend to be a little more relaxed about the ephemeral pieces because we know they're not going to last, and so people feel more comfortable. The average person might feel more comfortable being an artist themselves. Also, I think the ephemeral and art forms tend to leave themselves more open, for example, to women. And I don't want to overly stereotype here. I don't mean to be sounding too rigid and categorical about this, but I know I didn't grow up, for example, woodworking and working with metal and such that are more conducive to permanent, maybe more permanent installations. So I'm a big fan, as you can tell, of ephemeral art for its, I think, potential democracy. And yes, and so that's what I have to say about ephemeral art. If you put me on the spot, that's me winging it.
Donna, you're bringing up the context of, you're saying perhaps there's a gendered context of who produces that environmental art.
More of an openness there with ephemeral art. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I mean that's one could certainly point out there is different gendered natures within the art worlds. Certainly, we see spaces like the Vancouver Art Gallery show 90%, historically 90% plus white male artists, and you have community art, and I see Michelle is on the line too. So Michelle, feel free to jump in. But community art tends to be very much a female gendered art discipline. I know when I sometimes go to community arts events or community arts conferences, it's 95+% are women. And you also have the economic issues where certain art practices attract men and others are the domain of women. So thanks for pointing that out, Donna. The other thoughts on people's curiosity or interest around environmental art, temporary art that's meant to go back into the landscape versus what we saw with in the Netherlands with the famous outdoor sculpture parks and viewing and appreciating sculptural forms in the landscape. Anyone want to jump in or have experiences witnessing those different types of arts disciplines?
Hi there. Can I?
Please.
Yeah. So my name is Intu and my husband Jeff here. So we actually now based at UBC. But I'm an artist and an anthropologist. So I work a lot with forest-dependent communities, mostly in the tropics. We used to live in Australia, and I'm from Indonesia. But now we've been in Canada for 2 years, and in our work at UBC, I work a lot with different international students and minority groups and Indigenous students. And I'm interested in your work because we went to Maplewood Flats a few weeks ago, and we saw this thing that you were gonna talk about the environmental art, and we just got sort of supported by the Tri-Council to do some activities on the use of arts in sort of communicating science, and also about how do people use art in sustainable landscapes. So that's why we're sort of, it would be nice if in the future we could sort of in contact with you, and if we could do some work with you guys. And because I'm also, I do a lot of participatory arts. So we do a lot of like mural paintings with more than 150 people during big events like the climate change conferences in Paris, in Sydney, and so on. And we do a lot of things also during World Conservation Congress, which is actually at the moment supposed to be going on in Marseille, but then it's now sort of cancelled and delayed. So I would like to be in contact with you guys because we are interested in all these community arts, participatory arts, and also how art could change people's behavior and how art could help in sustainable landscapes and conservation, and also even helping people to improve their livelihoods.
Good. You have a very comprehensive analysis of that. I'm just reminded of this other project, the Wetlands Project. I'll just share the screen here. I don't know if people can see this. This takes place on Saturna Island.
I saw that when it happened. I watched the whole video.
It includes a radio broadcast. So that's an example where really on the extreme end that the landscape is interacted with through sound gathering, and it's not meant to be in situ. You're not actually in the landscape listening to like the birds. It's like tomorrow with Donna's project. She's pre-recorded it, post-produced it, and then we're having a listening party. So the Wetlands Project broadcasts across Canada for 24 hours the sounds of wetlands. Right, so there's thousands of people who will never be on Saturna Island witnessing that ecology and becoming aware of the fact of the important critical nature of wetlands in the ecological cycle.
The other thing I do is I'm a North Shore Wetlands Partners member, and we look after all the wetlands on the North Shore, including ponds up Hollyburn Mountain that are breeding grounds for the civet tree frog, northern red-legged frog, and salamanders. We bird also and do a bird count and post our results at Maplewood Flats, Lower McKay Creek Park, and also Ambleside Pond. And we got the big kiosk right at the pond where we can post our results monthly. So all the people can see the results and see what different birds are around at that time. So we get a lot of comments about that.
Okay. other folks?
Hi, my name is Mina Lee. I'm here on unceded territory referred to as Salt Spring Island. And first of all, I have to say, what an amazing presentation you've done today. I'm so moved by it. I was moved right away by what you said. There's so much in what you said in the very beginning. And I hope that you will post some links to not only the things you have said about reconciliation and the whole concept of redressing, but also some of the things you also mentioned in terms of the projects. Yeah, it's just marvelous, and I really want to share so much more with others about this. And myself, I actually, in terms of art, I thought of two things. I was able to go over to some of the things that, Kate's Park it's called, but the first time I took a bus from downtown First Nations Native Friendship Center, and we went across, and I got off the bus, and immediately I was like the wind in my face, and I looked over and saw this sign, and I read Whey-ah-Wichen, and that's not quite the right way to pronounce it, but it's just a fantastic place to gather, and what has happened there. And I think in terms of sound, well, Bill Henderson and Chilliwack at one of those gatherings were there, and Bill Henderson just went wild. I mean, the sound he came up with there, I've never heard him and be that strong. And of course, Bo Dick came too. He had come back from Ottawa from his copper cutting ceremony, and that was a very, very powerful gathering. But the other art thing I want to say about is connected to our ability. We had Grace Islet, which was a sacred burial site, being built on by a man from Edmonton who ran the big San Francisco trinket stores. And we went every morning and kayaked around there and tried to blockade. And eventually more government officials got involved. And these First Nations, we didn't even know them really, all of us who've lived here. And we bonded with them so strongly on that because they asked someone here to help them save that islet. And what really brought it forth for the government to come through was, I call it an art installation project done by Brian E. Penn, who's an incredible environmentalist and PhD in geography, and she's done some amazing art installations on the Salish Sea as well, using a painted toilet. But this one went into Victoria and the big Ross Bay cemetery. And of course, sacred burial site in a cemetery. So she and another person took a huge white sheet, and so it looked like a house on poles, and they stood there in that cemetery with the hashtag "No House Here." Well, that went quite all through the press, and that kind of thing, I believe that was the straw that broke the camel's back and got the government to buy back that islet, and the First Nations now reclaimed it and did all their ceremonies to restore it. So thank you so much. But as I said, I hope you give some links because what you have said is so important.
Thanks for that positive feedback, Miley. And it's interesting, the Grace Islet really did, it's an example where settlers have a role to play instead of just waiting for the Canadian state or the British Columbia government to make things right. It's easy sometimes for the colonial governments to simply kind of watch it and say, well, we don't know how to get involved, or these competing claims. And so whereas the settler residents actually just say, actually, this is just morally wrong. There's something that we can do. And that actually is enough momentum to force government's hand to recognize that, yes, actually we need to get out of this fence sitting and do something that's right. And that was very inspiring for the Salt Spring community, which really inspired the development of Raven, right? So you have an organization that's based in Salt Spring that's supporting First Nations legal fights across the province, and that's based in Salt Spring. And some of the same people that were involved in Grace Islet are involved in Raven. So it's interesting to see sometimes that momentum that occurs just through an arts installation or art intervention that brings community together. And thanks for acknowledging the Chilliwack, Bill Henderson performing live. For the folks who don't know, Chilliwack is one of the biggest rock bands in Canadian history, and Bill was playing at Kate's Park at Whey-ah-Wichen, right there on the tip with the wind blowing.
Whey-ah-Wichen. Okay. Thank you for that pronunciation. But the other thing is the bond that happened for us that got out there every day, and the bond that happened with our first, I say our First Nations, and well, you know, the Sayout, the Sartlip, the Cowichan tribe. We are just buddies now after that, you know, and it's beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just should mention that while we were the Wild Bird Trust of British Columbia and we focus on Maplewood Flats, there was actually a time when we actually had a land conservancy on Salt Spring, and the Wild Bird Trust of British Columbia actually had projects around the province. And so one of the ways that we serve our provincial mandate is not through this site of Maplewood Flats, but it's actually through Wingspan magazine. And the board of directors here is discussing how do we want to support and advance cultural and ecological projects across the province that involve settlers and First Nations. So that's something that we'll be looking at and potentially maybe talking to the Sierra Club or other organizations that have a similar mandate as ours and saying, hey, can we actually pilot and support modeling of the intersection of culture and reconciliation and restoration that advances the protection and habitat for birds, but at the same time repairs these kind of social and cultural relationships that are in small communities across British Columbia. So, Michelle, I see you there. Do you want to jump in at all and comment on the North Vancouver Arts Council's work? Or?
Sure, I'd love to, but actually I'm just gonna, what you said just made me think of something. And has anyone else been following the SFU climate change? I can't remember what the full name of it is, but it's been a weekly Zoom session on Wednesday mornings, and it's about how we can learn for supporting education awareness around climate change, how we can learn from what's been happening with the COVID-19 pandemic, and also how the arts can support that message and sharing that message. So I think it's in about its fourth week. The final and fifth week might be next week, but we've been learning a lot. A few of us from North Van Arts have been following just to see how we can help in community arts get that message through, that environmental message through, and how artists and community arts can support that. So it's been highly interesting and educational. I wanted to share too what you were talking about, Irwin, when you talked about how I've been thoroughly enjoying the Wingspan. Always got my copy. How you're connecting nature and culture. One of the recent projects of North Van Arts is the North Shore Culture Compass that we just launched in March. And what the North Shore Culture Compass tries to do is share the stories of the North Shore through a cultural lens. And what we learned really early on is that we can't separate on the North Shore nature and culture. They're so integrated, and especially when we're considering the First Nations, the Squamish and the Stewardship, who we've worked closely with. They're so intertwined and integrated. So I've got a big list here, and Irwin, Donna, and Leanne, I will be in touch because I've got about 10 things from Irwin's talk that I think we could list on the Culture Compass to help share that story. Thank you, Irwin, for bringing it up. Because what the Culture Compass does is it tries to share stories, and we put points on a map And the Wildbird Trust is the source of a lot of really interesting stories that come out both for the natural and the cultural heritage, telling the story of the land. So I just wanted to share that. And thank you very much for all of the really good information and all that you've been doing at the Wildbird Trust. It's been great.
Cool. And so we're on this.
There you are. Yeah, so you can see the map only covers the North Shore. We've got 10 categories, and there you've got. So one of the really fun categories is intangibles and stories, because there we can tell stories. This is the public art piece that you showed. So we can tell stories through public art. We can tell stories through in intangibles and stories area. We also have, the intangibles and stories is a really fun one. And there even, Irwin, I'm going to come back to you on, maybe we'll talk about getting your father on the map, as I didn't know about his philosophy. And I think that's really interesting, and the legacy that's left in the parks on the North Shore, North Vancouver district especially. The philosophy to promote wilderness and trails. And I hadn't noticed, but you're right, there aren't rose gardens in our parks. We've got trails. Under the Volcano Festival, we've got there as well. Yeah.
Yeah, the city of North Vancouver has a rose garden in Victoria Park.
I didn't know that. Okay, so but you're right, your father was in the district.
Not the district, yeah, exactly.
And I didn't know that, but I think that's an interesting story. So I think even if we put your father on the map in the intangibles and stories and tell the story of the legacy that he's left on our local parks. This piece that you've got up now, Lowry's Cabin, that's a public art piece by the Polygon Outside. It's an app that anyone can download on their phone, and you can even click on the link there and you can see they've done a reconstruction. An artist has done a reconstruction of what it may have been like to stand at Lowry's Cabin and look out at the waterfront. Another interesting and fun category is the First Nations category. That one is a really special category because we've been working with the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh to help, just as you said in your talk too, is put their face on the land so that when people look at the North Shore, they know that the people of this place are the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh. So we've been working really closely with them in developing this category. So it's a tool that they can use to tell their stories. We're not telling their stories. That's really important. But if you click on the arrow point, it will come up with what we call an asset, Wildbird Trust, for example, and the story. If you click on animal print, you see the paw prints there? That will bring up an important animal. And if you click on the audio, you can hear Janice Campbell has recorded audio pronunciation, so we can learn how to say that. So we can all practice. And what we're a future project that we want to do as well is commission First Nations artists to do drawings or illustrations of those animals so that we can put images of the animals on the map. So we've got lots of future projects.
Here's this is funny. So this is Ken Mayo's sculptures. My dad hired Ken in the 70s under the Winter Works program to carve totems. So Ken was not Coast Salish, but you had Capilano Road, you had Cape Park, you had different sites in North Vancouver with these totems, and it's sort of an inside joke with my friends at Slough, knowing that my father helped erase Coast Salish culture, but at the same time tried to lift it up, perversely not knowing this notion of place-based. He recognized, in the 60s and 70s that there should be Indigenous culture in the public spaces, and so he commissioned these carvings. But in fact, what we would have done now, 30, 40 years later, is we would have commissioned local Indigenous carvers. So
we're all learning. We're still learning.
Yeah, exactly.
Hi there, Irwin and everybody. It's Jeff Whiting, Artist for Conservation here.
Hey, you want to jump in here, Jeff? Hey,
I thought I actually don't have that much time before I have to steal away, but I wanted to say thank you for an excellent presentation, and I'm really excited by the vision here. in terms of its potential and what's already been started, I think it's great. And I just wanted to make one, I guess, throw one point in for discussion or thought moving forward. We looping back to the idea of there being ephemeral art, permanent installations, but another category that might be worth considering is, I guess, permanent plinths for temporary exhibits. So, in other words, I mean, it could installing effectively concrete or otherwise weatherproof structures where you could mount bronzes that could be on tour or temporarily installed for either very short periods or for a couple of years, that kind of thing, as another category of artwork that could be considered, I guess, in the long-term plan. Just wanted to interject that.
Cool. Yeah, I think that I welcome other people to jump in and talk about the idea of sculpture in the landscape. If that's something that people would welcome, if it seems odd. I don't know if Katrin or our Dutch friends want to, Hank, want to jump in, and if your experience of seeing in the Hoge Veluwe in the Netherlands landscape, if art is something that, what do people experience when they see, they go for a walk in nature, and is public art, is that something that you would like to see when they go outdoors? Just trying to unmute you there. There you are.
I remember, if I can jump in, a lovely walk in Switzerland, Kandersteg, and we walked through the forest, and I think it was trees that had fallen or been cut down, but what was left was sculpted. It was just carved, left where it was in situ and carved. And it was a great walk because as we walked through the forest, we just discovered things. We didn't know they were going to be there. And I love that kind of thing. It was lots of fun. And I think the trees, whatever was left, wasn't harmed. I think that's the important thing, is that everybody can see clearly that nothing's been added that's not natural, and nothing is being harmed in nature. So we're not adding anything that's going to be detrimental. But I love those kind of walks.
One little other point about ephemeral art. Right now, we're seeing in the world colonial statues that the colonial state has commissioned. And so I think of sculpture, at least in the Western tradition, in the white European tradition. On the one hand of the spectrum, we have these colonial, often quite phallic looking by chance, sculptures that are permanent and designed to be permanent because they're designed to control that space for all times. And we're seeing how really even those are ephemeral. So I think that's kind of interesting. So when we talk about ephemeral art in contemporary art, I think of ephemeral art as kind of, in some ways, one of the opposite ends of the spectrum of white colonial settler state art, which is about permanent installation of sculptures. Yeah, that's all.
I think that's I think you're making maybe it's intentional, a provocative challenge, because I think you're obviously correct statistically in terms of who produces what art is put on the pedestal, literally. But I think there's a danger there of then fetishizing environmental art as a kind of a purist, like, oh, this is innocent, this is somehow immune to critique, because I think if you look at the practitioners of professional community artists in Vancouver, there would probably be a race element to that discipline as well. So I don't think any genre is necessarily immune, other than maybe white classic rock and roll or something like that. Hank, do you and Katrin, do you have experience going to the Hoogevelo or seeing art in the landscape?
Yes, Irwin, thank you very much. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. We are not long-time Vancouverites. We live here in Vancouver since 2 years, coming from the Netherlands. And but I do remember that our first walking tour in Vancouver was in the Maplewood Flats park. It was before we knew you, Irwin, so the nature took us in that direction. I think in Europe you see more and more combinations of parks, landscapes, older landscapes, and sculptures coming up. Catherine and I have a little bit of experience with it, just as amateurs walking around in those landscapes. For me personally, it was always a wonderful experience being in nature and looking at art. And one of the most interesting things is I think that art is changing because nature is changing all the time. So it gives always new perspectives on what an artist put somewhere and which is changed by nature again. I want to say one other thing. We liked very much this beautiful landscape park near of Cologne in Germany. It's an old arm of the river over there. It is called
Museum Insel Homburg.
Yeah, it's called Park Homburg. It's an old, a very old landscape, and they've put there's some sculptures over there, and there's also a beautiful building where they have musicians in residence, and perhaps just a suggestion, it's wonderful to have a pianist rehearsing somewhere in a landscape and walking by and listening to the birds and have suddenly also a birds choir to beautiful piano music. Mm-hmm. So that's one of our personal experience. But thanks again for the wonderful presentation.
Sure. Yeah. And I should mention that before you were the Consul General for the Kingdom of the Netherlands in Vancouver, you were the head spatial planner, I believe, in the Netherlands. So you have a lot of understanding of how humans and communities negotiate and navigate their interaction with the landscape and how we plan and use public space. So those are issues kind of at the heart of what we're doing here too, is figuring out what is this landscape? What is our relationship to the landscape? Who are we and who is not here and who could be here? And so what role does art and culture play? And we can consider both the temporary nature, just as Henk was saying, this notion of sound. We do sound in the landscape during Osprey Festival. We have now an artist in residence program. So it could be that we consider also the temporary nature of the audiences, not just the temporary nature of the artworks. I'll just stop the sharing of the screen. Jeff and Intu, do you have more thoughts in your experience in Australia or Indonesia of some of these debates that communities or organizations or curating or commissioning bodies have around these tensions between what people are expecting in terms of appreciating culture in a landscape, or you're also specializing in bringing science into it. So there's lots of things that you're investigating.
I think the whole issue, all the issues we've raised this afternoon are fascinating. I'm very interested in them. A lot of my own work for several decades has been dealing with landscapes and what causes landscapes to be the way they are and what might be done to make them deliver more benefits to society. And we've come to be interested in exactly what you just said, the idea that art would help us to negotiate, to understand other people's points of view on the landscape, what sort of things they value and what sort of things they'd like to see. And so the object of this project that Intu has got funded by the Tri-Council is indeed to look at places where art can influence people's behavior, influence policies, can lead to better landscape scale outcomes. So we'd actually like to contact you after this session and talk about whether we might do some tangible things with you at your centre along those lines. So this is a project we're just starting. It's jointly run by Emily Carr and UBC. And we will be doing work both in British Columbia, but also in Indonesia, which is where we spend a lot of our time in Indonesia. That's where our field work is. But we have links also with Australia and other countries. So there's a huge amount of international interest now in this idea of doing more locally based things, place-based things. And I think the whole COVID thing is making us realize the value of not being totally dependent on all these global things all the time, but to have a greater degree of landscape scale, of local autonomy. And so this landscape concept and ways one can shape landscapes and ways one can share understanding of what landscapes are, I think is a really interesting and emerging issue. So maybe we could have a face-to-face event in Maplewood sometime and actually do something together, make some art together to share these things. So we definitely like to stay in touch. It's really interesting.
And I think the scale part of things is quite important, like working locally, but also working with people internationally, so that the understanding could be shared by all these different people. And the idea of the things that I'm sort of initiating at the moment, that we could gather different kind of stakeholders, including Indigenous people, private sector, like companies, government, and others, so that they can sort of share together how art can be useful in all these things, including in policy making or in getting economic growth and all those things. So we're gonna try to do some activities in Canada, but also in Indonesia. But in Indonesia, we will be having people from Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, and other places. So we sort of try to group different places, so that, because it is quite a long way, right? So, and I do hope that we could do something maybe in your space or something like that, because we sort of thinking we could do it in America or in UBC, but also it would be nice to have a space where it's really open to bigger audience, school kids and things like that, because we've been working a lot with when I facilitate mural paintings with more than 150 people, it varied from kids 5 years old to people who are 70 years old. So yeah, the different ages and things are also important to participate in all this.
Yeah, and I think to your point, I think we really do identify as a laboratory, and I think our practice is very intentionally. Our executive director, Leanne Payne, no coincidence, she's the former public art coordinator for the city of Surrey, and a longtime arts administrator. So, and we've worked at Gallery Gachet, a mental health art center in downtown east side of Vancouver. So there's lots of very significant applied practice around how to make art accessible, productive, connecting with people's mental health, civic issues, social justice. So, but I think also, given the moment in history we are in this specific site and our negotiation around redress with the local First Nations, we really want, with the North Vancouver Arts Council and our friends here locally, to really say, let's use this site as a place where we can actually practice some of these things that we talk about theoretically.
Irwin, may I ask you, did you ever see the film? I think the NFB did finally do a run on it, and it's about the totems were banned, as potlucks were in those days, and even the First Nation people disregarded their totems, so they were fallen down, and then a Indigenous man in Vancouver from the area went back and they restored the totem and built one. It's so moving, and I was shocked. I didn't know that totems, had been banned, and I think that's a really important part of our art history, certainly in BC.
Yeah, the way that they're deployed, I know this week with there's a lot of pressure on the Vancouver Police Department around defunding the Vancouver Police. And I noticed that the Vancouver Police Department marketing team posted a photograph of one of their Métis Indigenous officers standing in front of totems. And I just thought, well, why don't you just put them in front of a Greek windmill or an Italian restaurant? Like, you know, these totems had nothing to do with this fellow's Métis culture, and yet here's the Vancouver Police Department promoting this ignorant notion that, oh, well, he's Indigenous, so all Indigenous culture is self-same. It's like, well, when are we going to move past that? Just before we wrap up, I just want to invite anyone who we haven't heard, Melora or anyone else who wants to just jump in and share your thoughts before we wrap up. So we're going to be, this will be on Facebook. So if you want to share this video with anyone else, this conversation, it will be on our Facebook wall from Maplewood Flats. And I just want to thank you for spending this time with us. And sorry I didn't take you outside, but I think we accomplished a lot of work. Donna is chairing, as I mentioned, our programs committee, so I know she welcomes new members. And if you have an interest in applying some of this work, the programs committee would love to have you. We have a subcommittee dealing with public art. And we'll certainly follow up with Jeff and Into. And just want to thank you for your time, and I'll pass it back to Alice.
Cool, yeah. Thank you so much, Irwin. That was an amazing presentation. I definitely learned so much. Yeah, so we just, as a reminder, we do have another event tomorrow on June 14th, and that will be led by Donna, and it is a Dawn Chorus listing party, so that's going to be really fun. And then also we have a screening and a presentation by Hilary Highland and Iggy George about restoration and cultural reclamation. So make sure to check that out in the our Eventbrite. We'd love to see you there. Thank you.
Okay, and I'll just show you this. I don't know if you can see this.
We've lost your voice suddenly.
Alice, can we show this other video feed?
Yeah, sure.
Can you write your email address in the chat column?
Yeah.
So then we can get in contact. Thank you.
And others interested in this work. Jeff, I think Indu's met Jeff already.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just showing in my other video camera, the space that we're in.
Okay, hold on.
Yeah, I think, Jeff, I think we met at IRES in UBC when you gave a presentation several months ago.
Okay, I got you on the phone now.
Okay.
Very high pitched.
So here we can see the space.
The John Lohman exhibition. Yeah, that we had to shut down during COVID. Yeah, with the lovely sliding doors, so you can flow out into the back of the site.
All right. So thanks for being with us, and I guess we'll call it a day.
Thanks, Irwin.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.